Welcome to the latest and greatest BLEEP, BLEEP, BLOOP, BLOOP video presentation. Today's show is entitled Some Flat Washers Are Flatter Than Others. I'll be using different tools to measure the thicknesses of 38 different flat washers, the same ones featured in the intro. I hope you'll agree with me that the results are somewhat interesting. First up, we've got the three larger washers that appear at the very beginning of the stop-motion animation that kicks off this video. For these first two rounds of measurements, we'll be using a pair of digital calipers and a standard micrometer, the sort with an anvil and spindle that are both cylindrical and end in flat faces where they touch the thing being examined. Incidentally, you may have noticed that at the top of the table I drew up to hold the measurements for these three washers, I refer to them as thick, and then in parentheses added diam, as in diameter, preceded by a greater than sign. That was a spur-of-the-moment shorthand to indicate to myself that these were the washers that were larger, in terms of diameter, than the rest. Thick is confusing because these washers aren't necessarily thicker than all of the others, and larger diameter feels a bit unwieldy, especially if I'm going to be saying it again and again. So, from here on, I'll be referring to them as fat washers, F-A-T, fat. Also, I'll be recording all my measurements the good old-fashioned way, on paper using a pen. Since I'm doing this voiceover after the fact, I can confidently assure you that I'll fit all of those figures onto the same half an A4 sheet of square ruled paper that you can see on the clipboard right now. And with that out of the way, let's get back into the action. Here's my protocol. Pick up a washer, take a thickness reading, turn the washer a bit, make another measurement, turn it again, and take a third reading, then write all of them down. I'll be doing that 3 times for each washer, first with the digital calipers, and then with the standard micrometer, and finally with the point micrometer. I only have the one micrometer holder at the moment, so the point micrometer hasn't appeared on screen just yet, but it'll show up soon enough. Returning briefly to something I said a moment ago, in between thickness readings I'll turn the washer slightly so the next measurement isn't made at the exact same spot. But I haven't, for example, drawn radial lines at 120-degree intervals. However, I have written on them. I've lettered the fat washers A through C, and numbered the others. It's the most straightforward way of ensuring that I can group together all of the measurements taken of a given washer with the calipers and both micrometers. Ah, see the bit of something dangling from the edge of fat washer letter C? Let's have a gander at it under a microscope. See that red rod? It's not the lance of Longinus from Neon Genesis Evangelion, it's a red lead for a mechanical pencil, and it's 0.9 millimeters across, which is thicker than the normal being a 0.5 millimeter lead. I'm using it here to give you some notion of the scale of this defect. So what happened here? One of the two dies in a washer stamping press somewhere did a less than perfect job of punching this one out of a sheet of 304 stainless steel. Out of curiosity, I've remeasured the thickness of this washer, fat washer letter C, directly on top of its stamping defect and got a thickness nearly half a millimeter up from the other readings for the same washer. These values won't be included in the charts later. They're more blatant than the subtler factors that interest us today. But there you go, something else to ponder. No need to thank me yet, though I'd sure appreciate it if you would like, comment, and subscribe. Coming up next, the debut of a lovely 30-degree angle carbide-tipped point micrometer. The instrument we'll be employing for the third and final round of thickness readings for each of these 3 groups of washers. Here's a close-up of the anvil and spindle on the standard micrometer I'm using. They're 6.5 millimeters across. The crimson rod is, just like last time, a 0.9 millimeter diameter red mechanical pencil lead. Wow, isn't it beautiful? Feast your eyes on the point micrometer spindle and anvil. The latter drifts in and out of view. Apologies for my poor camera technique. The contact surfaces on those tips are, I've read, just 0.6 millimeters across. Now you've seen up close the contact surfaces on the ends of the anvil and spindle of both micrometers. Since the process of using a point micrometer doesn't appear terribly different from taking measurements with a standard, plain old regular micrometer, I'll be fast forwarding through the remainder of this portion of our program. In a very few moments, I'll begin moving washers across the surface plate in such a way that they pass beneath the carbide ball end of the dial test indicator's stylus. Deflections of the stylus, such as the sort of elevation changes I'm indicating in a somewhat exaggerated manner with my hand here, are translated into radial movement in the dials on the face of the indicator. Welcome to a special spliced-in scene that wasn't originally part of the plan. Only once I'd written my way this far did I realize that I needed more time and some additional footage, video with more explanatory oomph, for lack of a better word, before the clip of using a dial test indicator to check out the 3 fat washers. The 2 oblong metal things are gauge blocks. That's G-A-U-G-E, blocks. And they're precisely 1.05 and 1.10 millimeters thick, respectively. Right now, the 1.05 millimeter gauge block is beneath the indicator's stylus, and the indicator's large hand is pointing at just a hair over the 3rd mark after the 5. That's 8. Watch the dial. Voila! What happened when I dragged the 1.10 millimeter gauge block into place? The dial leapt up to the 13 mark. What's 13 minus 8? 5. What's 1.0 minus 1.05? 0.05. Each of the divisions on the scale running around the rim of this indicator's face is equivalent to 1/100th of a millimeter. 0.01 mm. So the indicator is working perfectly. Now we'll see it again. I repeated that demonstration for the benefit of a GoPro, but kept the main camera rolling. The dial test indicator used in this presentation has a range of 1.5 millimeters, but the marks on the rim only run from 0 to 25, and then count back down again. So the large hand can only show us 0.5 millimeter of difference in, given the way I've set everything up here, height. But there's also a smaller dial, the one with a shorter hand and a scale that runs from 0 to 0.5 and then to 1 and 1.5. If you watch while I drag the first gauge block beneath the stylus, you can see that the large hand makes multiple complete turns before stopping at the 8 mark. And the little hand on its separate dial goes from pointing about midway between 0 and 0.5 to pointing at the 1.5 mark. So I'm going to take a moment here to rack the old noggin and try to anticipate some of your dial test indicator related questions. Okay, here's one. Why did I grab the bezel and turn it so that the dial would be zeroed on the granite surface plate instead of zeroing it onto the 1.05 millimeter thick gauge block? Excellent point. I should have done that. Then the 13 minus 8 calculation would have been unnecessary. We're coming to the point where, just for the fun of it, because I don't often need to drag out one of my gauge block sets, I ring, W-R-I-N-G, the 2 gauge blocks. That's when you hold them perpendicular to one another, press their precisely machined surfaces together, and then twist them into parallel position, and abracadabra. They sort of stick together, until you unring them by twisting them apart again. Anywho, back to dial test indicator talk. Point numero dos, number 2. Why didn't I set up the dial test indicator in its holder so that the little arm on its little dial was pointing at 0 instead of at about 0.3? In other words, why did I set it up so that the stylus was in firm contact with the surface plate and slightly deflected? Another fine point. So long as the distance between the surface plate and the stylus's tip had been less than a millimeter, less than 1.05 millimeters to be precise, the 5 mark, 0.05 millimeter difference in thickness between the 2 gauge blocks would have registered on this dial test indicator. And now here you can see me dribbling oil from a bottle of Starrett branded tool and instrument oil, I think it's Starrett 1620, onto the gauge blocks, making sure they're well coated and then wrapping them back up in that pink tissue paper. I believe that stuff is some sort of anti-corrosion material, VCI, volatile corrosion inhibitor paper, but I don't know for sure. Keeping them oiled up is part of hopefully preventing rust from gaining a foothold. That's also why I'm wearing gloves while handling them. It's nearly time to hop back over to the main thread of this presentation, to the point where I'm running the 3 fat washers under the stylus of this dial test indicator. But first I'm going to throw out a bit of a spoiler by telling you what to expect to see. Particularly attentive viewers may be able to guess at the thrust of what I'm about to say. Your first hint. As I mentioned earlier, this device has a range of 1.5 millimeters, which is large for this sort of tool but rather small in real-world terms. Your second hint comes in the form of a chart. Feast your eyes on the results of the 3 rounds of thickness measurements that I took of the fat washers earlier in this video using 3 different tools. Here's the same chart but with the y-axis origin hiked up from 0 to 1 millimeter. As the text under the chart title explains, the symbols are color-coded. Dark blue represents thickness measurements taken with calipers, red are for those taken with the standard micrometer, and point micrometer measurements are shown in green. By the way, do you notice a correlation between the measuring instrument used and the measured washer thickness? In each case, the blue symbols are at the top, slightly thicker, and the green are at the bottom, slightly thinner. The differences are small but consistent and readily visible. No statistical wizardry is needed. We'll come back to this correlation later. In the meantime, let's put the proverbial 2 and 2 together. We've got 3 washers, 2 of which are about 1.5 millimeters thick, and a measuring tool, a dial test indicator, with a range of 1.5 millimeters. And some dummy, that would be yours truly, has set up the dial test indicator so that its stylus is slightly preloaded against the marble surface plate. So here's what to expect. Washers A and C will exhibit no surface level variation under the dial test indicator. That's not because they are perfectly flat, far from it, but because the indicator will be maxed out. Washer B, which as we've seen is anomalously thin, will give us a bit of a show. To reiterate, washers A and C will show nil surface level variation due to the way I set up the dial test indicator, but we can expect the run of the stylus across washer B, because it's considerably thinner, to be more interesting. Now for washer letter B. I'm rubbing it between my fingers for a sec because I was struck by its thinness compared to washer A. Watch the dial. Here comes washer letter C. It's the one with the stamping defect, a bit of an overhang, about 0.5 millimeter tall, that I probed with a pencil lead under a microscope for you a few minutes ago. I run this washer under the indicator twice. After the first go, I turn it 90 degrees and then push it through again to get the stylus to move over the defect. All for naught, obviously, but it's good for a laugh, right? Now I have a slightly better understanding of how a dial test indicator works, so I could completely redo this part of the video. But washer letter B gives us a taste of what we're looking for, and leaving the rest in feels more honest. You're getting 100% genuine cinema verite here. Cinema verite, that's French for truth cinema. Now we're going to pick up the pace a bit. Here we're starting in on the 3 rows of 5 washers that appeared in the intro, the ones that pop into existence at upper right. By the way, how do you like the felt pennants? Okay, calipers and standard micrometer, you know the drill. As you may have noticed, these are very extremely thin. Ultra-thin metal gaskets is how the vendor describes them. They're intended for use, I believe, in injection molding, as spacers and for shimming. That's the 5 thinnest done for now, but fear not, we'll see them again when it's time for the point micrometer measurements. So, to spell it out, as you can see from the felt labels on the bolts where I store the washers in between measurements, we're looking at 5 each of 3 different claimed thicknesses. That's 5 0.1mm thick washers, 5 that are 0.2 millimeters thick, and 5 of the 0.3mm thick type. And we're on to the 0.2mm ones now. Oh, while I'm thinking of it, in case anyone is wondering, the zany looking carpet scrap under the micrometer stand isn't there for purely aesthetic reasons. This workbench is covered with a thin layer of clear silicone sheet. Like all things in life, the stuff has its advantages and its disadvantages. For instance, it's got an anti-slip quality, which is nice. Little bits of this and that don't easily shimmy off onto the floor. You set something down, and it generally stays put. Over in the disadvantages column, one of the minuses is that it's not completely inert. Some other types of polymers seem to react with it in a certain way. Like the 3 foot pads, they're vinyl I think, though I could be wrong, on the underside of this micrometer stand. So without anything as a buffer, like that piece of carpet, after a couple of days, if I hadn't moved the micrometer stand, I might discover an unsightly grayish brown stain in the silicone sheet at each of the spots where one of the foot pads had been. Alright, time to bring the point micrometer back into action. Zooming right along. And here we are in dial test indicator land once again. The parameters of the indicator and indicator setup haven't changed. And as you can see if you look closely, the preload is the same. We're still doing cinema verite here, right? But these washers are ultra thin, so they won't max out the indicator. They're well within its range. The main issue this time will be that these things are so thin and small around that pushing them across the surface plate beneath the indicator stylus using my fingernails is easier said than done. When I manage to get one of them fully under the stylus, the indicator reading will jump from 5 through 0 and over to the other 5. Since each tick on the dial equals 1/100th of a millimeter, that equates to 0.1 millimeters as expected. Here comes the sort of push stick. It's just a bookmark made out of a piece of cardstock with an iridescent coating on one side, but it almost sort of works well enough. Now, here at last, the mystery washers. They're actually not terribly mysterious per se. Truth be told, they're just a group of similar seeming M6 stainless washers left over after I'd gone through and sorted a bin of mixed use fasteners. Space on that sheet of paper is beginning to get tight, and I've got to record 3 sets of 3 thickness values for each of these 20 washers, so out comes a ruler and a felt tip pen. As we go along, I'll write the measurements for each washer so that they're on top of the same line, 1 line per washer. It reduces the odds of a screw-up while I'm writing down the thickness values, and again later when I read them off and type them into a spreadsheet. Done with the calipers, and here I go using a mechanical pencil as a pointer to draw your attention to some anomalous washers. Mystery washer number 15 is the thinnest of the bunch, and number 20 appears to be the thickest. Let me pick those 2 up to show them to you. I'll try turning them a bit to catch the light from different angles. Here we go. I've got them bottom side up. Did you see how there were rings of shadow running around the edges of the outside of each washer and around the inner hole, the donut hole? Well, I hope so. It was plain as day to me. And it's that time again. Standard micrometer time. We've seen standard micrometer measurements a couple of times now, so I'll zoom through this round at 20 times speed. I'm working my way in reverse order, filling in the table from the bottom up this time. Using bolts to keep these washers in sequential order, they're all numbered, remember, and this way it's easier to end up with mystery washer number 1 on the outside right under the wing nut, and number 20 at the bottom near the head of the bolt. Whoops! See what I get for trying to be Joe Cool and flick the wing nut off the bolt and catch it in my palm? It's off to the races. I'm getting the measurements needed to fill in the final columns of the last table, and doing it at 20 times speed. Done. Time to scope out one of these mystery washers with a dial test indicator. Check it out. Managed to catch that wing nut this time. Surely that's a good omen. It's mystery washer number 1, Nummer 1. Giving it a bit of a twirl closer to the camera so that you can see, from the way the light hits it, that it's not really flat. Whoa, there's a lot of difference in elevation over the distance between the outer and inner edges. High, then lower, then high again. If If I were doing this over from scratch, knowing what I know now, I would preload the indicator against the middle of the meat of one of these washers, turn the bezel so the dial is pointing at 0 there, and then push the washer back and forth beneath the stylus. Now let's pick up the thread I laid down back while I was running 2 gauge blocks under a dial test indicator. And here are the charts of the measurements of the thickness of each of the 3 fat washers that I showed you then. To alleviate the visual monotony, I'm going to insert a clip taken from the gauge blocks bit to play in a loop behind these charts. At that time, I proposed to you that there seemed to be a readily visible correlation between the type of measurement instrument I used and the thickness value measured, at least for those 3 fat washers. Despite having foolishly set up the dial test indicator so that it would be maxed out for most of the fat washers, I was able to show you some real variation in thickness for one of them, washer letter B. Next chart. This one shows the thickness measurements for the fat washers and the 3 rows of ultra-thin washers at the same scale. When we ran one of the ultra-thin washers under the dial test indicator, how much variation did we see? None. The dial held steady and didn't move. So we would expect the measurements of each ultra-thin washer, whether taken with calipers, a standard micrometer, or the point micrometer, to be much closer to one another than was the case for the fat washers. And that's pretty much what we see in this chart. The measurements for the ultra-thin washers in most cases look almost like single points. There's generally little vertical spread visible at this scale. And if we hone in on just the ultra-thin washer measurements, there sure does look to be less of a correlation between the type of measuring instrument and the thickness measured, doesn't there? It's time to consider the mystery washers. Check it out. Generally, there's a large spread over the range of measurements, and the caliper measurements run higher while the point micrometer readings run lower. Even at this scale, with the y-origin starting at 0, you can see they're very similar to the fat washers. Zooming in makes it even clearer. So what am I ultimately getting at here? Nothing revolutionary, but perhaps something you've not thought about very much, if at all. I think that the smaller the contact surfaces on the measuring instrument, the closer the measurement will get to the thickness of the sheet metal from which the washer was originally stamped. Here's a chart combining the mystery and ultra-thin washers. So as I was saying, the edges of the jaws on a pair of calipers, as I used them, span a larger chunk of a washer than the flat faces of the cylindrical anvil and spindle on a standard micrometer. Earlier on, I also showed you a microscope's eye view of first the anvil and spindle on my standard micrometer, and then of the same parts of my point micrometer. The faces of the standard micrometer's anvil and spindle are 6.5 millimeters across, whereas the contact surfaces at the tips of the point micrometer's anvil and spindle are, as you can see in the microscope footage, much smaller. They're somewhere around 0.6 millimeters, I think, so less than a tenth the size. So I'm saying that the smaller the contact surfaces on a measurement tool, the more accurate the measurements will be. Surprise, surprise. Yes, but. If, on the other hand, what you care about is, for example, how much farther the head of a bolt is going to protrude if you use a particular washer, then the thickness that you get with the calipers might be more useful. And this concludes today's presentation. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one. To get access to exclusive subscriber-only content, you can support me on Patreon. And I look forward to your comments here and over on my page. The idea for this video first occurred to me while I was sorting through a large cache of used 304 stainless steel fasteners. Most of the screws and nuts and bolts and washers were easy enough to group into piles of identical specimens which matched up perfectly to existing lots of vendor-labeled fasteners in my personal hardware stockpile, so all of them went into their respective corresponding bins, except for one pile, a small hill of, nearly 100 M6 flat washers with outer diameters of 16.8 something millimeters, as measured with my trusty no-brand beater pair of digital calipers. They didn't really match up outer diameter-wise with any M6 washers in my fastener bins, and some of these mystery washers felt thinner than the rest, likely stained from thinner sheet metal. At the time, I thought that the thinner and thicker washers might have come from 2 separate lots. I'd never really closely scrutinized any flat washers before and didn't realize vendors would sell packages of washers with this much variation from one to the next. But, as in the case of the fat washers, we've seen that there's less uniformity than I would have expected. And that's how this all began, with me taking a pair of calipers to these mystery washers, one after another. Okay, this time we're finished for real. I'd really appreciate it if you could give me a like, leave a comment or a question, and subscribe so that you'll be notified when I release new videos. And there's already lots of patron-only content over on my Patreon. I hope you'll consider supporting me over there.